Welcome back, this is Ray. And you know what, today we're going to be reviewing one of my highest performing lenses. And you heard me right, it's even higher performing than the Helios. The Helios took the back seat, which I never thought would happen. This is the Voigtlander Color Ultron. It's a 50mm 1.8 vintage lens. It was made in the 70s and 80s. And the name is kind of deceiving. It says Voigtlander, but I'll tell you about the history of it later. Voigtlander is a company that went through so many changes. But what I like about this lens is it doesn't have a lot of the quirks that vintage lenses have. You can set it wide open and take a shot, and it looks great. The edges are not as terrible as the Helios wide open. The colors and the contrast pop. It doesn't have that kind of color shift as the Helios, and I need to stop comparing it to the Helios, but it is now my favorite lens. So if you're curious about a high performing modern vintage lens, stick around. I'm gonna show you everything I know about this lens, including some video and image samples. Stay tuned. Okay, so before I go any further, it's important that we talk about the history of Voigtlander. The first thing I want to say is in English-speaking countries, we're really pronouncing it the wrong way. The correct pronunciation, to the best of my ability, is Voigtlander. It's a German name, and I'll probably put somewhere on the screen the proper way to do it. Throughout the review, I'm still going to probably say Voigtlander because I'm going to forget or for whatever reason, but that's important to know. The next most important thing is Voigtlander is the oldest camera manufacturer ever. They were founded in 1756. That's so long ago. And but what's interesting is over the years, so many different companies have bought the rights to use Voigtlander that it's not really the same company as it was in the beginning. The heritage is always high. All the companies that use the name have done their best to produce quality lenses, but it is not the same company as it was back then, and that's important for us to know going forward. One thing that I really like about these vintage lenses, especially the 50mm, is how shallow a depth of field you can get. And the reason that's important is when you're using a micro four thirds, like the Lumix G7, you don't get as much shallow depth of field. So what's cool about these is sometimes if you're shooting something up close, the depth of field can be even too shallow, and you have to stop it down a little to get a clearer image. But it gives you more creative possibilities having this deeper depth of field, and it's something that, for example, that you're looking at the Panasonic 25mm right now. You're looking through it at me. It's wide open at f1.7, but the background isn't terribly blurred. If I were to put this one on, the background would be much more blurred. But blur is not everything, but that's one thing to know, is you do get some sweet shallow depth of field with these older 50mm lenses. All right, I want to try to come up with something I don't like about this lens. It's not easy, but one thing I will say is it only has 6 aperture blades. So what that means is if you're focusing on something nearby and there are highlights in the background, the highlights tend to take on a hexagon shape of the 6 aperture blades. Fortunately, the blades are rounded, so it's not terrible as, for example, this Carl Zeiss Planar. What I don't like about this lens is at f2.8, the aperture blades take on the shape of a ninja star, and it looks really bad. It's distracting. So that's one thing to know about this lens. It only has 6 blades, if that matters to you. Another thing I appreciate about this lens is the way it handles flare when light is coming in. If you look at the front of the lens, it has a beautiful coating. It's like a reddish purplish look to it, and that's what helps with the flare. So even if you're pointing it near and into the sun, it will flare. It just won't be terrible, and that's what the coating is doing. As a matter of fact, I used to use this metal lens hood on the Helios because when it's wide open you would get a lot of flare. But I notice on this lens I don't really need it. It's not really as necessary. But one interesting characteristic this lens has is if it's wide open and the light is kind of shining directly into the lens, you'll sometimes get what's called the ring of fire. It's a perfectly thin circle of a flare, and it's unique. There's only one other lens I've seen do that. It's the Carl Zeiss Planar. I think they're both very similar. You either like it or you don't, and I guess in most cases it may be distracting, but the good thing about it is all you have to do is slightly turn it from f1.8 to maybe 1.9 or f2, and the ring will completely disappear. That's how well designed this lens was. And I almost forgot to mention, this is one of the more modern lenses that was designed with computers. Most of my other old lenses were designed with mathematic calculations, so I think that's what helps this lens do so much better and still retain that vintage character. That's something that's hard to find. I know we spoke earlier that the company Voigtlander was bought out by many different companies over the years, and keep that in mind, because when you take photos with this lens, if you're used to Carl Zeiss lenses, you're going to realize that they have a very similar, almost exact character, and there's a reason. Because one of the companies that bought Voigtlander in modern times was Carl Zeiss. So this lens is actually a rebranded Carl Zeiss Planar. And to go even further, the company Rollei that made the iconic Rolleiflex twin lens reflex cameras back in the day, they also have an exact copy version of this rebranded Rollei. So I know it may be a little confusing, but it's important to know the history of these lenses and why it is what it is. And one more important cool thing about this lens is the front element. You can't really see it from here, but the front element is almost perfectly flat. And when I was cleaning it, that's when I realized, wow, it's flat. And I looked up the diagram of it, and it's unique. There's a version of this lens called the Carl Zeiss Ultron that actually has a concave front element. And it is also one of the highest performing vintage lenses out there also. So I guess they do have some of the similar heritage. Okay, so that is my review of the Voigtlander Color Ultron. I hope I said that correct. As you can see, it's a very capable lens, especially for one that is vintage. It retains a lot of the character that we love in those lenses while still giving good performance. So I hope you enjoyed this review, hope you learned something. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them below. But always remember, no matter what lens you choose to shoot with, as always, until next time, Keep it real.